We've been asked to be very brief, so I'll just give you sort of a broad sketch of my thinking in the next 10 minutes ago. And I would begin by pointing out that, perhaps at the risk of stating the obvious, that al-Qaeda's obituary has often been written in the 10 years, and almost in each juncture that we were told that the threat had receded or that the organization itself had ceased to exist. Unfortunately, we've often been disappointed. I'm not entirely certain that that's going to be any different now. One reason I say that is because really over the past 10 years, almost all of the conventional wisdom about bin Laden and al-Qaeda has been proven fundamentally or consistently wrong. In the middle of the last decade, there was a particularly intense debate that I was a principal party to, where it was argued that al-Qaeda had ceased to exist as an organization, that leadership no longer mattered, that the terrorist phenomena had evolved to a point where there was no longer any kind of command and control being exerted, and instead that the threat had become entirely bottom up, prosecuted by self-selected, self-radicalized individuals, by bunches of guys operating completely on their own, and that al-Qaeda had ceased to exist in any meaningful form. And we heard repeatedly that al-Qaeda had become an ideology, not an organization, and that it had become a name that was used for the appellation for franchises. We were also told that bin Laden had become an irrelevant figurehead, cut off and isolated from his sympathizers and supporters, as many often said, perhaps jocularly, that he was living in a cave somewhere, completely isolated, and was no longer playing any kind of an active role, whether it was in al-Qaeda's tactics, strategy, or operations. Well, even the thimbleful of documents that was released last May, the 17 documents, nonetheless, even that very small collection of archival material, nonetheless, I think, read critically, paints a very different picture that completely dismisses almost all the conventional wisdom that existed on bin Laden and al-Qaeda. First and foremost, even those documents make very clear that bin Laden was intimately involved in all dimensions of al-Qaeda's operations. Now, admittedly, bin Laden and al-Qaeda did have very uneven communications with the affiliates and associates arrayed throughout the world, and I think there's two very good reasons for that. One is the obvious one, for reasons of security. Bin Laden was not communicating in any kind of a real-time sense, that he was often using the good old-fashioned method of the runners with, if not a cleft stick, but something similar to that. That consequently, because he was relying on personal emissaries to communicate, there was often a 30-day or more communications loop, which obviously opened up plenty of opportunity for misunderstanding, for misinterpretation, I think in some cases, for even the affiliates and associates to ignore what bin Laden was saying. But that gets to the second reason. What people forget is that neither bin Laden nor al-Qaeda created or established any of the affiliates or associates. These were all from the start independent entities that, for a variety of sometimes idiosyncratic or individual reasons, decided in some instances to formally ally themselves with al-Qaeda, in other instances to actually adopt the al-Qaeda name, and yet in other cases, though, to maintain close ties with al-Qaeda, but nonetheless not formally ally or affiliate itself with the movement. So one shouldn't look at that relationship as an exclusively, client-mentor or, commander-subordinate one, because the affiliates and associates, that was never the purpose. And I think this was a conscious choice that al-Qaeda made in the aftermath of Operation Enduring Freedom and its dispersal from Afghanistan to move to a much more decentralized structure, because bin Laden and Zawahiri, and especially Zawahiri as the key strategist and architect of this decision, understood that for the movement as a whole to survive, it had to become more decentralized and that it had to grant greater freedom to the affiliates and associates. But we see bin Laden, even from that very modest amount of documents, very intimately involved in day-to-day decisions of both al-Qaeda and even playing a very prominent role in those of the affiliates and associates. For example, bin Laden blocked the ascension of Anwar al-Awlaki within al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as indicative that he still had influence over the affiliates. We know that going back to at least 2003, Bin Laden was very interested in West Africa as a fertile ground for the expansion of al-Qaeda, a strategy that one has to say just in the past year has paid vast dividends, as even 12 months ago, if not al-Qaeda, but at least al-Qaedaism or al-Qaeda's ideology was not present in as many countries as it is today. A year ago, we would have said that al-Qaeda had been able to expand to Boko Haram in West Africa. Now we see movements at least espousing al-Qaeda's ideology or making common cause with al-Qaeda in Mali, Mauritania, and Niger as well. We also know that bin Laden himself was in direct contact with Boko Haram's leaders and that he oversaw this expansion of al-Qaeda into, again, what he saw opportunistically as new potential fertile areas for al-Qaeda's growth. We know as well that bin Laden and Zawahiri maintained close ties with the Pakistani Taliban, that bin Laden, Zawahiri, and Mullah Omar met regularly and that they often conferred and discussed strategy, especially strategy once the United States withdrew from Afghanistan and the opportunities that would therefore be presented. Now, a lot was written and discussed about al-Qaeda's brand, and I think many people reading these documents interpreted bin Laden, I think rightly, as being very concerned about al-Qaeda's resonance, that al-Qaeda may have been losing the struggle for Muslim hearts and minds, and there was some discussion that bin Laden was thinking of rebranding the organization. But I have to say that on closer inspection of those documents, although all that is true, there's a very important nuance that's often being overlooked or dismissed. Bin Laden was very concerned about al-Qaeda's declining brand because he felt that al-Qaeda's political message wasn't being clearly or sufficiently communicated. His complaint was that most of the media's coverage of al-Qaeda focused on only one part of al-Qaeda's formal title, al-Qaeda, the military base. And he says in those documents, it was neglecting the Wo Jihad, al-Qaeda, the military base, and holy war, or holy struggle. And to his mind, it was shortchanging al-Qaeda. It wasn't focusing enough attention on the fact that al-Qaeda had a mission, that it had an agenda, and also that al-Qaeda was being portrayed as just a bunch of mindless killers without having some political platform. And he sought to reinvigorate the al-Qaeda brand, perhaps by adopting a different name or more effective one that would more accurately reflect al-Qaeda's ideological pretensions and better communicate al-Qaeda's self-appointed role as the defenders of Muslims everywhere. Now, let me make a brief digression here. I think one of the reasons, too, that this was ignored for its significance is that we've often been consumed by the idea and have hoped that if we repeat it enough, it will come true, and I think it certainly is true, that al-Qaeda has killed far more of its own co-religionists than it has Jews, Crusaders, Christians, and others. But historically, al-Qaeda would hardly be the first terrorist group to have survived or gained popularity on the backs or over the bodies of its kith and kin. The National Liberation Front in Algeria, between 1954 and 1962. Even the exact number of how many people were killed in Algeria is still unknown, but it's somewhere between 1 million to 1.8 million. The vast majority of those deaths were inflicted by the FLN against their fellow Muslims, not by French military forces. In fact, even on the torture issue, the FLN, and this is not to in any way absolve or excuse the French military's use of torture, but the point is that the FLN tortured and abused exponentially more Algerians than the French army ever did. And remember, the cover of Time magazine a couple of summers ago had the horribly disfigured photograph of a poor Afghan woman whose nose had been cut off and ears had been cut off and tongue had been cut off. That was standard operating procedure for the FLN during the Algerian Civil War. It did not alienate their base. In fact, their very effective use of psychological operations, of propaganda warfare, as we see in the opening scene of the landmark film, The Battle for Algiers, the 1965 Pontecorvo film, shows that most of the attention was successfully focused on the French depredations and very little on the FLN. To use yet another example, the Provisional Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland between 1968 and 1998 killed over 3,000 Irish Catholics, their own brethren, and fewer than 600 British soldiers or Royal Ulster Constabulary police officers. And we know that Sinn Féin, the Provisional Irish Republican Army's above-ground political support party, is now the most powerful and popular political party in Northern Ireland. There was one document, though, in particular that caught my attention, I think underscored how much wishful thinking had entered into the interpretation of those documents in inferring al-Qaeda's weakness. And that's the document dated August 27th, 2010. As you may recall, in the summer of 2010, Pakistan was racked by torrential rains, by unprecedented monsoons and flooding that caused thousands of deaths and the uprooting and disruption of the country's commerce and livelihood, and indeed caused large loss of life amongst the Pakistani population. And this is a particularly interesting document that bin Laden has written to his subordinates, where basically he's expressing his concern about the weather and the fact that his fighters might get wet. And I think, like any good leader, he's very concerned about his men and about their families, and he's asking his lieutenants to assure that they're well taken care of, that they haven't suffered unduly. But isn't that a remarkable document? Bin Laden is more concerned about the weather than he is about the chance that any of his fighters might be stopped at a Pakistani military or police roadblock, or might encounter Pakistani military forces engaged in disaster relief and therefore might be identified and apprehended. In my view, at least, that document speaks volumes about how comfortable bin Laden and al-Qaeda felt they were in Pakistan. Further, even with that thimbleful of 17 documents, there's no evidence in any of them that al-Qaeda operatives or al-Qaeda fighters experienced any difficulties traveling from Iran to Pakistan, from Pakistan to Afghanistan, or indeed traversing Baluchistan. So the bottom line is that one needs to be cautious about any of the conventional wisdom, I think, not least about the Arab Spring and al-Qaeda's irrelevance. Firstly, al-Qaeda is still strongest at the periphery of the dramatic developments of the past 18 months. Pakistan, Yemen, to an extent, Somalia remain core, key al-Qaeda operational environments and sanctuaries. Over the past 4 years, despite the immense pressure that al-Qaeda has been under, perhaps the greatest onslaught ever directed against a terrorist group in the history of mankind, al-Qaeda as a movement has been able to achieve the impossible. It's been able to expand by more than 50%, to cultivate new affiliates and associates, and as I described earlier, to spread its ideology to West Africa. I would argue that in the future, Syria is going to prove pivotal to al-Qaeda's fortunes one way or the other. And it may be, as many people argue, al-Qaeda is on its last legs. It may be that al-Qaeda's demise is imminent. But I think al-Qaeda has grasped Syria as being the fulcrum that capable of catapulting itself back into prominence. Syria is cherished by al-Qaeda. Ed Hussein had an excellent piece a couple of weeks ago in the National Review. Syria is regarded as al-Balad al-Sham, the land of the Levantine peoples, referred to in the Quran, written about by Ibn Taymiyyah, the 13th century theologian, who talked about the importance of fighting against the infidels, both Christians and, as he pointed out, the Nasaris, the Alawites. And in many respects, Syria has many of the elements that Afghanistan had in the early 1980s. An uncontroversial cause, lots of willing foreign fighters, infusion of cash, an organization capable of marshaling external resources and directing them to Syria, and then Western confusion and acquiescence. So, in conclusion, let me wrap up and say, in my view at least, it's far too soon to declare victory in the war on terrorism and to declare al-Qaeda Central defeated and finished with. Historically, on their own, decapitation strategies have very rarely been successful. And I think one of my criticisms of the drone program is, although I think it's been enormously effective tactically, it is just a tactic and shouldn't be confused with a strategy. I think we need to start thinking about the potentialities and challenges of a fragmented jihadi movement that will emerge, that rather than the one big target that we've gotten used to in one place over the past decade, carrying out at least operations that had an established modus operandi, and for us a clear footprint, that we became extraordinarily effective at interdicting and preventing. I think we're going to face smaller, more dispersed adversaries who gravitate between groups, whose memberships are shared rather than are static. These entities will have a lighter footprint with no real established modus operandi. Consequently, they'll be more difficult to track, anticipate, and predict, as well as even identify. Also, we need to think about terrorism more as a permanent fixture of conflict in the 21st century, as rather than a war that's being defeated. I say this for two reasons, and I really am moving to wrap up. The first one is I think we have to be very careful about the progeny of seminal jihadi leaders emerging out of the woodwork as heirs to the movement bequeathed to them by their elders. These are the sons, brothers, cousins, whose fathers, uncles, brothers, relatives have either perished as a result of the drone program or in the past 10 years in the war on terrorism or have been incarcerated for extended periods of time. And I would argue this new generation is just now girding its loins and sharpening its sword to join the struggle. I think we also have to be concerned about the old made new. That is, former leaders emerging from prison or exile to take over and assume the movement's helm and thereby reinvigorate the movement. One example, and there are many, would be Saif al-Adil, a skilled al-Qaeda operative who's been detained in Iran for nearly a decade. And then finally, I think we have to prepare rather for an end of al-Qaeda, but for a new strategy advanced by al-Qaeda. As Thomas Hegghammer has written, a hybrid strategy that involves both the far enemy and the near enemy, with a focus, as we see it today, very much on near enemy issues. But al-Qaeda, if anything, over the past decade has always shown itself to be as opportunistic as it is instrumental. And if the instrumentality is, as it clearly appears today, on the near enemy, what we will see is continued efforts by al-Qaeda to identify gaps in our defenses, to exploit weaknesses in our defenses, and then opportunistically to move in and take advantage of them. Thanks very much.
When I saw the question that Matt put before us, I realized that I was going to have a little bit of difficulty answering it because the framing of the question presupposes three things that I actually believe are false. So I'd like to begin with that, and then I'd like to explain where I stand on the question of whether I believe al-Qaeda Central is relevant. First of all, it presupposes that we can divide al-Qaeda into separate parts that have very little to do with each other. And I actually disagree with that proposition. Second, it believes or seems to argue that al-Qaeda is relevant only when it's attacking the United States. And thirdly, it seems to argue that the main objective for al-Qaeda is, in fact, to attack the United States. And I disagree with all three of those, and I'll explain why. First, can we divide al-Qaeda in this way into three separate parts that have very little to do with each other? I think that brings us back to a question we've been struggling to answer since 9/11, and that is, what is al-Qaeda? If you take a look at the 1990s, we actually have quite good documentation on the organization of al-Qaeda in the 1990s, and I think that's persisted to this day. They viewed what we call as al-Qaeda Central as the high command or the military leadership of a worldwide jihad, one that they were going to be the sort of Pentagon for, provide the combatant commanders for, but not themselves engage in the fight. They were the brains of the operation, the commanders, the leadership. That is what we today call al-Qaeda Central. What we call the affiliates were, in fact, the combatant commanders, the guys on the ground who were going to divide the world up to a bunch of AORs that they would then be responsible for not only conquering, not only imposing a version of Sharia that 99.9% of the Muslim majority world finds objectionable, but also ruling. So combatant commanders a la the Roman Empire. And finally, they hoped to awaken, as they put it, the entire Muslim ummah, the community, to fight for their cause. Their argument was the reason we failed in our local jihads throughout the 1970s and 80s was because we cut ourselves off from the masses and from a mass movement, and we won't do that again. We will use propaganda to radicalize individuals to join us around the world, and that's what we call radicalized, unaffiliated individuals. Those three parts for al-Qaeda are in fact one whole that are governed, they hope, by one strategy, one eventual objective that they hope to achieve, and by one high command that to a greater or lesser extent is able to extend command and control over them. The second piece that I think I disagree with is what the main objective of al-Qaeda is. There seems to have been an assumption since 9/11 that it's all about us. Right from the very beginning, I disagreed with that profoundly. Not just because al-Qaeda was saying it wasn't all about us, but because what they were doing made it all about other things. So, for instance, as Dr. Hoffman mentioned, far more Muslims have been killed in their fight than non-Muslims. Far more peoples of Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on have been killed than American soldiers. In fact, one of the figures I saw said 8 times as many Muslims have died as non-Muslims, and that doesn't include a lot of the civilian deaths in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. That's just through terrorist attacks, not on the battlefields. So could that all just be a mistake? They set off a bomb in Pakistan, and it just so happens to kill 50,000 Muslims and 1 American? That was all a mistake? I think not, because I think a lot of their war is in fact not with us at all. It's with the rest of the Muslim world, in an attempt to convince them through argumentation, but also through intimidation and violence, to join up with their cause. In fact, their main objective, one they have stated repeatedly since the 1990s, and that they are in the process of seeking to achieve now, is not to attack us, but rather to create the perfect ideal utopia, an Islamic state ruled by their version, their extremist version of Sharia. And attacking the United States was a means to that end. We have, in fact, confused means and ends. The means of attacking us meant that they hoped to scare us off of their property, what they saw as their territory, their rightful homeland, to convince us to withdraw our troops from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere so that we couldn't intervene or interfere. Bin Laden, in many of his speeches, would look back at the United States intervening in the Muslim world and pinpoint this as the reason we have failed to succeed. U.S. support for the Egyptian military chased down our jihadists. U.S. support for Turkey, for Saudi Arabia, for every other country has meant that we have been incapable of achieving our ends. So the right thing to do is first scare the United States off, make it too expensive for us to stay in their countries, and then we'll be able to do as we please. After that, the second part of this grand strategic plan was to impose their vision of Sharia, then to create things called emirates around the world, and finally to unite them somehow into what they called the caliphate on a worldwide basis. Those are their objectives. Attacking the United States was a means to that end. And finally, if al-Qaeda has not been attacking the U.S., what has it been up to that does make it relevant? Well, all you need to do is look over the Muslim majority world for the past 2 years, and you can see what they've been doing. They've been declaring affiliates all over the place. They've been declaring emirates. They've been imposing their version of Sharia every place that they can. And slowly, bit by bit, they've been attempting to impose their vision of utopia, an extremist version of Islamic law with their guys in charge everywhere that they possibly can. So in places like the Sinai, Tunisia, Libya, Mali, Syria, actually the list goes on and on, northern Nigeria, you can see this vision in action. But to many Americans, that's happening way over there, doesn't involve Americans, doesn't involve American lives. We're dealing with financial crisis. Can we really do anything anyway? And so the conversation turns solely to keeping ourselves safe, which we've done a terrific job of. We've kept ourselves safe, but we may just have done it at the cost of losing the world. Thank you.
Okay, so while the first 2 speakers have talked about al-Qaeda sort of in a broader perspective, I'm going to get a little granular here and talk about first a little bit about jihad in the West in terms of what's been going on over the past year, and then also briefly touch upon the online world related to al-Qaeda's jihad. So between July 2011 and 2012, we have seen 86 plots within the West and Western interests abroad. Among how I define plot, though, is successful attacks, material support, individuals arrested for online jihad, individuals arrested before an attack occurred, and kidnappings abroad. Of these 86 plots, 13 were internationally based, and most of them were kidnappings by al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, of Westerners in the Sahel. Of these 86 plots, only 2 of them were successful, though. Both of them were this past March. The first one was in Belgium at the Rita Mosque, where it was firebombed, and they ended up killing a Shia imam. And then the second one, which many probably are aware of, was in France when Mohamed Merah was involved in the attack on the Jewish school children. There are some areas of concern currently in the West. The first one is Germany. This is because over the last few years we've seen a rise in the amount of jihadi activism there, but also because many individuals that were involved in the German jihadi scene have recently gone abroad to Egypt, and many within German intelligence are worried that it's now a safe haven where they might potentially plan attacks or even join up with some of the jihadists in the Sinai or potentially Syria and then have this training and then go back to Germany. Another area of concern is the United Kingdom, which has had a persistent problem over the past decade and a half or so. One of the issues that the British intelligence is currently worried about is that there are reports that there are hundreds of UK Muslims that have gone abroad to Syria now, and while they're not worried about them potentially being killed there, they're worried about the individuals who might be infected by al-Qaeda's ideology there, and then instrumentalized and brought back home and trying to attempt more attacks as we saw in the middle of the last decade. So turning to the United States, though, in the past year we've had 13 plots. 5 of them were arrests before there were actual attacks, 4 of them were sting operations, and 4 of them had to do with material support. There was also one attack within Somalia of an American Somali who did a suicide attack against ANISAM, which are our allies there who have been fighting al-Shabaab over the past few years. And that's the 4th American who's conducted a suicide attack. So what is the state of American jihad currently? It's actually its weakest point. It's been probably since around 2003 to 2004, when most cells were swept up in the post 9/11 operations by the FBI and local law enforcement. While that might be the case, what happened from around 2003 to 2007 that we should keep in mind is that while they might have been more or less defeated operationally on the ground, they started to regenerate a lot of cells on the internet. So that is one area that many should be focusing on now. While it doesn't appear that we see any large signs of this currently, it's something that many should be focusing on, especially in the backlash to some of the politicization of some of these issues within our country currently. One of the reasons also that the level of jihadi activism within the United States has gone down is one, because of the death of Anwar al-Awlaki, who died about a year ago. Another issue had to do with the controversy over Omar Hamami, who is a senior commander for al-Shabaab in Somalia. He had some disagreements regarding Sharia matters, and because of that, he became ostracized with the leadership, and there was a whole public thing on YouTube about it, and many Westerners who sort of saw him as potentially the next al-Awlaki started to, get disappointed or even deterred from, talking on the internet about these kinds of things. So as a result, there aren't any current ideologues that really speak closely to Americans. While Adam Gaddan is still in the field in Afghanistan and Pakistan, he's never really had much of an audience within the United States. Another reason that American jihad is not as large as it has been is because al-Qaeda themselves in Pakistan have mainly been focusing on directing efforts in the Arab world because of the uprisings that we've seen in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and the like. So what about the state of the online jihad? While they still are proliferating on their forums, there used to be about 5 to 8 main ones a few years ago. Now there are only about 2 or 3. One of the potential reasons is burnout, but a more likely reason is that the younger individuals involved with the movement have been shifting more and more towards other places like Facebook as well as Twitter especially over the past year. But the forums remain very important to al-Qaeda Central. This is because they need them for authentication of their materials. Without the forums, they don't have a way of letting individuals that are their online grassroots supporters know that the content is actually from them. So what about the differences between, the Arabic-speaking forums and the English-speaking forums? In a study that I recently did that will actually be published in the next month or so, the English language forums lag far behind with the Arabic forums. The Arabic forums are about 7 times more active. And when you look at in some of the Arabic forums, there are English subsections, and when you look at them, there maybe 1% of the discussion is in English, whereas the rest are in Arabic. Though interestingly, with the Somali forum that is affiliated with al-Shabaab, you see about 17% that is in English language discussion, which suggests that the Somalia operation and field of operations there are highly discussed by Westerners. So what about Twitter? It's useful for events that are in progress. Al-Shabaab has been a really great example of this. Over the last year, they've reported about their different operations in the field in Somalia under the hashtag Jihad Dispatches. And also when the controversy over Omar Hamami first occurred, that is the first place that they actually responded to it instead of actually going to the forums. It also could be a potential interesting way for operatives in a future attack to use it. As we saw with the Muhammad Merah attacks, actually, when he was holed up in his apartment, he created his own Twitter account and started tweeting what he was doing inside of the apartment and talking about how he was doing this glorious attack and how he's becoming famous. So this could be a tool, like a real-time tool, that they are able to engage with their own grassroots followers that we might see evolving over the next few years. While the online jihad might not necessarily be as big in terms of forums as it used to be, the overall online architecture is in good shape and continues to be al-Qaeda's best safe haven for disseminating its cause. While many talk in the media about shutting down the forums or shutting down Twitter accounts or YouTube accounts, that's not necessarily the best thing, for one, because it creates a whack-a-mole situation, which we've seen in the past, where if a forum goes down, then a second-tier forum will fill the void. So it's an endless cat and mouse game there. Further, there is many opportunities for intelligence to be had for individuals, especially with social networks like Twitter and Facebook. While many of these individuals have private accounts, through intelligence, they can see who's a friend of whom on Facebook or who's following whom on Twitter, which allows to gain a broader perspective on sort of who's involved in these networks. So there are a lot of advantages to actually keeping these forums up, as well as these Twitter accounts and Facebook pages. Just one final note with regard to Syria, because it's sort of been this huge catalyzing force and really reinvigorated the movement in the West as well as online. Based on some data I've been tracking for the past 8 to 10 months, there are anywhere between 68 to 294 Westerners who are currently in Syria. A good portion of them are British, actually. So this is one area that many people should be looking to, because as we have seen in the past, once individuals go off to a new war zone, while many go over there for altruistic reasons originally, some end up being inculcated with al-Qaeda's vision and then could potentially try and bring that back to their home country and proselytize there, or even then conduct some attacks. So with that, I'll finish my comments. Thank you.
So, al-Qaeda core or al-Qaeda senior leadership is greater than the sum of its parts. And I'm wary of taking one slice of that pie and analyzing it really carefully and then drawing out larger conclusions about where the al-Qaeda central is today. But we're going to do it anyway when it comes to the financing, because there are some important lessons I think that can be drawn. I'll tell you from the outset, I think the al-Qaeda core is still relevant. And I think it's relevant because it has been willing to change with the times. Because it is willing to fold back in, as Bruce said, that near jihad. Because it is willing to focus on messaging, which arguably is what al-Qaeda sought to do in the outset, not only to be the only ones out there fighting, but to train others to do it too, not only to train others to do it, but provide people some startup funds to go out and do it too, but in time to create this global insurgency that they wouldn't have to run on a day-to-day basis. But I do think that increasingly, we're going to see splits in command and control between elements of al-Qaeda senior leadership and some of these al-Qaeda affiliates, which increasingly are operating on their own. Imagine, as Mary pointed out, imagine al-Qaeda core as a pentagon for this global jihad. And then imagine the Pentagon desperate for funds, suddenly unable to finance the command and controls, and in fact going out to them for funding. Once upon a time, al-Qaeda core was relevant because not only of the operations that it carried out, but the training it provided, the funding it provided to others. There have been a bunch of declassified intelligence reports that have come out over the past year. One from 1997 documents how bin Laden's support to the Gamal Islamiyah, one of the two major Egyptian groups at the time, as well as to Algerian and Libyan groups, was significant because bin Laden and al-Qaeda were collecting donations from wealthy donors, primarily in the Gulf and in Western Europe, on behalf of the IG, and then providing those funds, specifically operational funds, to the Gamaa. A report from the following year, from 1988, documents how, specifically due to a shortage of funds, Ayman al-Zawahiri and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad turned to al-Qaeda, and for all practical purposes, already in 1988, were incorporated into al-Qaeda. Zawahiri wasn't too keen on the idea, but he lacked money. This was the only thing he had available to him. Now, other CIA reports document, for example, that an estimated 15 to 20,000 different militants went through the al-Qaeda camps, that the camps were financed through abusive charity, wealthy individual donors, tuition that some of the attendees paid, etc. None of this is happening today. The times have changed. Because of the raid in Abbottabad, because of other leadership losses, because of the Arab Spring, because of a failure to adapt and to be willing to use tactics that it believes is below itself, al-Qaeda senior leadership has fallen way behind when it comes to financing and is now in a position where it has to ask others for funds instead of providing those funds to others. By virtue of no longer controlling those purse strings, it has lost some command and control. And I would still argue that doesn't mean that the al-Qaeda core is in any way irrelevant. You know, right after the Abbottabad raid, officials talked about how important they believed bin Laden was as a character for raising funds for the organization, as a symbolic and galvanizing figure, and how it was no longer clear that donors would be willing to provide money to al-Qaeda now that it lost its founder, because they didn't really know who was in charge, how much in charge Ayman al-Zawahiri was, or how their money might be used. In fact, bin Laden's death was only part of the setbacks al-Qaeda was suffering, part of the financial setbacks they were suffering. Taken together with other leadership losses, it was a much, much larger setback. And it wasn't just the loss of operational leaders, and it wasn't just the loss of operational leaders from al-Qaeda core, but people from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as well. But it was also the fact that they lost people who were themselves important in al-Qaeda's financing. Consider, for example, the loss of Mustafa Abu Yazid, Sheikh Saeed, or Abu Zaid al-Iraqi, who had taken over management for al-Qaeda's financial operations in Pakistan after Abu Yazid was killed. You know, it reminds me of another CIA report that was declassified back from April 2001, which stressed how important bin Laden's financial lieutenants were. That bin Laden would make financial decisions on how funds were spent, yes, but he entrusted key lieutenants with various aspects of his financial networks, including fundraising, investing, what types of fund transfers to use. The loss of these types of individuals is especially important. And this left al-Qaeda in search of funding sources from its more established now affiliates, who were raising money hand over fist, in part through criminal enterprise. Now, al-Qaeda's always thought of itself as a cut above the other groups. Think about, from the small number of Abbottabad documents that were released, this debate about what is permissible money. Could al-Qaeda accept money that was the proceeds of drugs? Could al-Qaeda accept money, for example, some of its Palestinian affiliate wannabes in the Gaza Strip? Could they accept money that reportedly was being offered by Fatah or by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, because they're so close, especially the latter, so close to Iran? These types of debates demonstrate how uncomfortable al-Qaeda is with going where the money is if it's in places where it's not completely comfortable. And so while the affiliates jumped into the realm of raising money through criminal enterprise, al-Qaeda core stayed out. to its detriment. So you had al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb making tremendous amounts of money through kidnapping for ransom, which arguably is the only reason it's of any import today. It was a not-so-capable group that didn't have so large a following, and then was able to raise millions and millions of dollars in kidnapping for ransom, and suddenly it's able to provide money to Boko Haram and to others. And there are even some who have said to me they're concerned that Zawahiri might come with his handout to AQIM or others asking for funds, as he did back in the day to Zarqawi in Iraq, where he begged for 100,000. He didn't specify the denomination because our funding trails have been cut short. Consider al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, bank robberies, al-Qaeda in Iraq, skimming money off of stolen, skimming oil and selling it, kidnappings, etc. All of this, al-Qaeda Central was looked down its nose at and was not involved in. And so what it was left with were some perhaps unanticipated channels that it was more comfortable with. And so, for example, it made a deal with Iran that its financial operatives would be able to raise money in the Gulf, in particular Kuwait and Qatar, and send that money through Iran with Iran's okay, so that they could get the money where they needed it to be. In July 2011, the Treasury Department designated Iran-based al-Qaeda financial network, including Yassin al-Suri. A few months later, the State Department followed up with a Rewards for Justice rewards, the first time ever the State Department issued a Rewards for Justice amount for a terror financier. And when they made this all public, they specifically declassified information that al-Suri and others operates in Iran under an agreement between al-Qaeda and the Iranian government, and that Qatar and Kuwait had become this permissive environment for extremist fundraising. Another interesting avenue that it sought out, again, perhaps one that many might not have anticipated, was working much more closely in terms of finance with Lashkar-e-Taiba. Lashkar-e-Taiba, of course, has had significant overlap with al-Qaeda elements. Many al-Qaeda members were found in Lashkar safe houses, etc. But again, Treasury made a designation in 2009, and it's continued since, indicating that Lashkar-e-Taiba was providing money to al-Qaeda core, and in return was getting travel facilitation and other types of support for attacks, including the Mumbai attacks, the 2007 attack on the Samjota Express, etc. Another area that indicates significant change is the fact that we have now the rise not only of these affiliates, but of violent extremists. And whereas on the one hand you have these fairly wealthy affiliates, again, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and kidnapping for ransom, KFR is maybe the #1 type of terror finance issue that people are dealing with today. But when it comes to homegrown violent extremism, it's an entirely different type of a problem. Today, when you're dealing with a homegrown violent extremist, those traditional financial barriers that may have existed before for recruits to go to the global jihad, to bring that tuition payment, to make that travel to Afghanistan, to elsewhere, those don't apply. So the financial barrier isn't there, the costs aren't there, you don't need to have that formal connection. And it's why FBI and others continuously inform that it's not that they're unconcerned about terror finance, even to al-Qaeda core. Of course they are. And several of the domestic cases we've had, too, that I can think of, involve people here in this country raising money for extremism abroad. But they're concerned about the message, concerned mostly about al-Qaeda core's message, much more than they are about al-Qaeda core's funding. It has a hard time funding itself, let alone funding others. All of that said, the al-Qaeda core remains very relevant. First of all, this messaging is nothing to laugh at. This messaging, again, I would argue, arguably is a sign that the group is finally getting where it always wanted to be. Not having to run the day-to-day of every single operation, but creating a tidal wave where people are doing what al-Qaeda wants them to do without al-Qaeda having to be involved, without al-Qaeda having to set up a training camp, without al-Qaeda having to provide the money. Second, unfortunately, the bottom line is, while terrorism is actually expensive and the institutional costs can be significant, any particular attack is fairly inexpensive. And as we saw with the failed Times Square bombing, a few $1,000s sent via Hawala in that case from Pakistani Taliban, and you can have a fairly sophisticated attack, one that in that case we did not thwart, but that they just failed at. We could, God forbid, have an attack tomorrow, and a line could be drawn back to al-Qaeda core, and people will be speaking very, very differently than they have been about whether al-Qaeda is relevant. There are people today who are debating, not only outside government, but inside government, whether we should declare the end to al-Qaeda, and that al-Qaeda in Iraq and al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, they are different. I think that would be not only politically unwise, but severely premature. Usually, when I host these events, I take the moderator's prerogative and I ask the first question. But you've heard a lot from us, and so I'm gonna pass on that, and I'm going to start from the audience. Please let me catch your eye. I will get to everybody, and I'll go in the order that I see you. Panelists, let's try and keep our answers short, and because of the cameras, please do come up to the podium to answer your question. Yes, from State Department.
Thank you very much for this. Dan Srebny from the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. Ask any of the panelists to answer the question from two slightly separate angles. One is, to what extent in the current environment is it advantageous for the so-called affiliates to identify themselves as al-Qaeda rather than Ansar Sharia, Ansar al-Din, or other so-called monikers? And the second is the extent to which, if there is another successful attack or operation, to what extent the perception of it being connected to al-Qaeda Central or al-Qaeda Core is important to those mounting the attacks and to those trying to deal with them. Thank you.
On that first question about the affiliates, whether they want to be publicly associated with al-Qaeda, I think there has been in the past some reluctance to do so, except after a very long period of preparation or thought or debate. Because to declare yourself part of al-Qaeda was to call down the wrath not just of the United States, but the international community, and it led to all sorts of bad effects, like getting your finances, financial streams cut off. But one of the changes that I see in Zawahiri's strategy since the death of bin Laden, actually it's sort of twofold. The first is he is actively pushing the creation of so-called affiliates in a lot of different ways. There's been this huge multiplication of them. And the second is that he is pushing another name for them, and that is, as you said, Ansar Sharia, or some other name than al-Qaeda. But this, I think, reflects back on a debate that had been apparently going on inside of al-Qaeda itself for some amount of time, and it is reflected in one of the documents that came out earlier. I don't think they liked the name al-Qaeda. They didn't think it reflected what they were all about. And I think these new names that we're seeing are a truer reflection of the way they view themselves. They're not just a base, they're not even just a base of jihad. They're also about Sharia and about imposing Sharia. And so supporters of Sharia is how they view themselves, I think, more than just a base of jihad. Did someone want to answer the second part?
We'll leave that. Rob?
Thank you all very much. Let me reclaim the moderator's role and ask you the opening question. Mary offered her view of what al-Qaeda's strategy is. If I understood you correctly, it was avoid America, lull America into a false sense of security, and win the rest of the world. Let me ask the other panelists, what do you think al-Qaeda's strategy is today? How should we view it?
Well, I think actually this goes back to the previous question, too, about the al-Qaeda name. I think right now the main game for al-Qaeda anywhere is the near enemy and the local struggles, and therefore I think there's a de-emphasis on the al-Qaeda name because it'll distract from the local struggle, may provoke intervention. But I think that's very different from saying that al-Qaeda Central is not involved. I think over the past decade we've seen al-Qaeda Central adopt a very conscious strategy of being in the background. I mean, this is, to my mind, this has always been very clear in Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda has not operated as a separate independent unit, but rather using our own terminology, has embedded itself amongst local jihadi fighters for the obvious reason. It doesn't. Al-Qaeda's Central's operatives don't know the terrain, often don't know the language, and left on their own would probably either get lost or be slaughtered. So therefore, they've played an enormously critical force multiplying role, both in terms of training, Fazul or Saleh Nabhan with al-Shabaab, classic examples of this. I would argue the same thing was going on in Kunar province and elsewhere. So I think al-Qaeda still is behind the scenes, plussing up both kinetically but also in the provision of intelligence and training. And that remains a core part of its strategy. And this goes back to my earlier point that, in Knights Under the Prophet's Banner in December 2001, Zawahiri drafted al-Qaeda's strategy as it was being dislodged from Afghanistan. I think they've remained relatively faithful to that strategy. You read that document, Zawahiri talks about, the buzzword today, lone wolves. I mean, he talks about people just taking up a knife and going into a mall and stabbing others. So all the elements that we see played out in al-Qaeda's operations today, I would argue, were defined over a decade ago. I think Mary's quite right in how she described al-Qaeda's strategy as very much working locally, to the extent that American and Western forces are still present, weakening them, enervating them to ensure that there's an accelerated withdrawal, and also sapping any national will anywhere in the West to intervene again. And then, in essence, al-Qaeda sees a vacuum that it hopes that it can fill. The one thing I don't know if I would disagree, I think I would embellish or I would emphasize that Mary perhaps didn't mention, is this element of opportunism, which I mentioned in my own presentation, which I think is embedded in al-Qaeda's DNA. Even though it wants to, as Mary said, it may want to avoid attacking the United States, I think, or the West in general, Europe, when an opportunity presents itself, they will take advantage of it. And in my view, this was clearly explicated with this, very convoluted plot involving a British Muslim who was an MI6 agent who offered himself up to AQAP. Okay, there's a certain element of that yes, does very much evidence AQAP's desperation to grab, a clean skin and immediately spin them around and deploy them before intelligence could detect them. On the other hand, I think that speaks very much to the opportunism that's riven through the entire movement, that if they have a chance of attacking the West, and especially if they have a chance of attacking what they still regard as the most lucrative target, which is commercial aviation, they're not going to avoid that opportunity. So I would say their strategy right now, across the board, both the affiliates and al-Qaeda Central, is to focus on the near enemy, to focus on turning the toeholds that they've been able to establish in West Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, hopefully into footholds. That is their main preoccupation, but that doesn't mean that when and if they're presented with the opportunity to attack the West or the United States, they wouldn't take advantage of it. And I think there's a simple reason for that. They understand that that type of attack will once again regenerate profound fear and anxiety. I mean, they saw it with the printer cartridge plot 2 years ago that wasn't even successful, that we were spun around. And what they hope from that fear and anxiety translates to more support in general for al-Qaeda, both for al-Qaeda Central and al-Qaeda everywhere, that it still is a player, that this would enable them to recruit even more people than they already are, and also that they hope that this would be another source for increased funding and revenue through donations.
Rob up front.
Bob Lieber, Georgetown University. This on?
Yeah.
Bob Lieber, Georgetown University. Bruce mentioned that Syria was absolutely pivotal now for al-Qaeda. Would you please elaborate on that just a bit, but also pick up on what are the policy implications for the United States? In terms, do we have means to influence those outcomes, or is it much more distant?
Well, again, I think there's two sides of this. One is al-Qaeda's long-standing preoccupation and fixation with Syria, which I think most people don't understand. On October 7th, 2001, when bin Laden, just when U.S. offensive operations began in Afghanistan, and bin Laden once again declared war on the United States, he specifically referred to the treaty that resulted in the destruction of the Ottoman Empire and the recreation of what were once the Violette or the Seljuks of the Ottoman Empire, of Lebanon, Syria, present-day Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel, Palestine, as one of the great stains amongst the Muslim people. Bin Laden frequently talked about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the 1916 agreement between British and French statesmen that, in essence, solidified that division of colonial responsibility. So they see Syria, as I said, theologically, Ibn Taymiyyah, who lived in, of course, what's today Syria, they see it in religious terms as an important cradle of the Muslim peoples. They see it in modern terms as enormously significant because it symbolizes the artificial division of the Muslim world and the Zionist colonialism that was imposed on it. So there's a visceral pull towards Syria that I think few people have really understood or paid attention to. This is, opportunistically, and you see this in Zawahiri's statements. I mean, this is what will revive al-Qaeda, or will not. Maybe it won't. I mean, the other part of your question is there's a vacuum, I think, in Syria that groups like al-Qaeda have been a lot more adept in filling than anybody else, least of which the United States or the United Nations. So in that sense, they see it as tremendous opportunity, and this actually plays into the earlier question about what their strategy is. What I found equally remarkable and significant over the past year is al-Qaeda's renewed fixation on secularism and on secular targets, whether it's in Iraq itself, but now spreading into Syria and I believe elsewhere. And that's the card I think they're going to continue to play, exactly to strengthen themselves. And of course, with the Alawites, they have a traditional enemy, a despised minority. It gives them wider traction beyond Syria itself, potentially in Lebanon and elsewhere. And in that sense, I think Syria is so important for them because it's given them perhaps the only opportunity they have to revive their fortunes. And I would argue the longer, as we've seen, this unstable situation in the civil war in Syria goes on, the better at least they believe. I shouldn't say the better their chances. I'm not sure about that. The better, though, certainly they believe their chances of success and the chances of their revival are.
Doug, in front.
I'm Doug Fife, the Hudson Institute. All of you stressed in one way or another the importance of ideology. And I was wondering if you could comment on efforts being made or not being made around the world to systematically take on the al-Qaeda ideology. I mean, do you see the British government or the Indonesian government or any governments in the Middle East or elsewhere systematically working on opinion leaders, whether they're clerics or journalists or scholars, to refute the foundation, the intellectual foundation of the al-Qaeda ideology?
Take one for the team. I believe that this is the future of counterterrorism. That we've all gotten quite good at tactical counterterrorism, tapping the right phones, kicking down the right doors, trying to prevent the next attack. There's no such thing as 100% success, but we've gotten pretty good at it, and thank God our track record is pretty good at foiling and frustrating attacks. We've also had several lucky incidents like the Times Square bombing. But where we are still not sufficiently good is strategic counterterrorism, which is the battle of ideas, countering violent extremism, etc. There are some people here in this room who work on this every single day, and there are some really good ideas out there on how to go about it. The one unfortunate constant tends to be that people, and certainly governments, are very uncomfortable debating anything that has to do with religion. And so long as we are dealing with terrorist groups that frame their activities in terms of religion, any religion, there's going to be tremendous discomfort in confronting that ideology. That's unfortunate. It shouldn't be government that is having a debate whether a religion says this or that, but there are plenty of things we can be doing, some of them you laid out there. That said, there are some very interesting ideas out there. The Global Counterterrorism Forum with the State Department has been pushing very hard. One of its big focuses is on countering violent extremism, and it's starting to work in areas where it thinks it can make greatest impact. For example, prison populations. And there's an excellent program that's being put together there. It's being run in multiple countries, and there's a lot that we can learn actually from what's being done in places like Indonesia or Singapore, the UK, elsewhere in Europe, where they've been in many ways more forward-leaning than we have here. My concern, I've said this from this podium many times, is that in the United States, and I live here, so this is my greatest concern, in the United States, we actually are much better at countering violent extremism as such abroad than we are at home, because we're more comfortable engaging in those types of activities abroad. We do a lot of things that we put under the rubric of countering violent extremism, some of them appropriately so, in this country that are at the periphery. Reaching out and building relationships, outreach to different communities here in the United States, that's good. But that is not actually doing anything to take on the message, and I do think there's a lot more we have to do there. Okay, next question. Yes, Bob over here on the left.
Bob McBrien, former. This is addressed to any of the panelists. With al-Qaeda being perhaps more of an intellectual body in disparate jihad throughout the world, will the fact that financing through such things as the Taliban's raising of funds through narcotics, through the huge influx of narcotics into the African states, and at the same time that we have more jihadists moving into the African states, we've seen, of course, separately Hezbollah engaged in fundraising using narcotics and other forms of crime. You have kidnapping for ransom. Is the restraint that might have been present on fundraising from illicit activities going to even matter anymore? Are illicit activities going to become the primary source of funding, and a source of funding that maintains various forms of violent extremism for decades to come? I note that other writers have noted over time that the longest forms of insurgency almost always have their own self-contained means of raising money.
In a nutshell, I think it's an open question. It's probably a matter of debate right now within al-Qaeda core circles as to whether or not the organization is going to continue bin Laden's line of strictly setting a red line there, in part because they're so desperate and in part because it's been so lucrative for everybody else, including just about every other franchise out there. There was a major disruption of al-Qaeda Islamic Maghreb relating to drugs coming through Africa. We've talked already today about a lot of the other criminal enterprises. It's organized and it's unorganized, meaning some of the homegrown violent extremist groups as well we've seen funding themselves through crime. I don't know that it will necessarily be the wave of the future. It's the wave of the now, because the previous mainstreams, through abuse of charity in particular, and individual major donors, has been so successfully, at least for now, curtailed. But that really is a game of cat and mouse, and there are still major donors. We see that that is geographically something that moves. So again, senior officials say that whereas it used to be that the primary concern was individuals headquartered in Saudi Arabia, now the main issue of concern is individuals in Qatar and Kuwait. That doesn't mean it's exclusive, but I do think that criminal activity is so lucrative, and drugs in particular. If the UN estimates that it's, I think, a $3.2 or $3.5 billion a year enterprise, it's got to be more than that. And that means if you're an illicit actor, you want a piece of that. Yeah.
I'd like to provide just a provocative counterpoint to that. So one of the things that really struck me about the bin Laden's vision for his organization, even in the 1990s, was that he had this real sort of grandiose, almost megalomania about his own abilities and where his group was going. So, the global jihad, the ability to carry out an international insurgency when there's just a few thousand of you guys hanging out in, sort of the, not one of the garden spots of the world, let's put it that way. But he said something that was very interesting and that I think is relevant to this discussion. In September of 2000, he said to his followers, shortly something big is going to happen, and then we're going to have to regard ourselves as a government in exile for the entire Islamic world. Now, it's typically grandiose and as I said, megalomaniacal, but it says something about how he at least viewed himself, that he was going to be sort of emperor of the world, right? The emperor of the world doesn't dirty his hands with raising money, right? People bring him money, right? So the vision that I see him portraying when it comes to money is he actually is the one who collects the zakat. He collects the charity. The charity is traditionally only given to the leaders, the emirs, the commanders of the country, to the caliph, in fact. And then he decides how it's distributed. And there's two other ways that the commander, the emir, the caliph would collect money, and that is through, well, there's many other ways, through taxation, which al-Qaeda's affiliates have been doing all around the world, and specifically for him, something called fay and ghanim, which are two kinds of sort of tributes. 20% of all spoils of war, 20% have to be sent back to the caliph or the emir. So rather than having to go out and dirty his hands, I believe from all of this activity that all these affiliates, or however we want to use it, he actually calls them the regions. That's the term he uses for all these groups. The regions are collecting for him. I think that probably 20% of that has been shipped back to Afghanistan, Pakistan all along. And I would be unbelievably surprised if there's not something called a Beit al-Mal, someplace in that region that's sort of like Scrooge McDuck's big swimming pool, because here's the other thing. It can only be collected in, or should only be collected in gold, silver, and jewels, because that's the only legal form of currency in his mindset. So I have this vision of this, huge like swimming pool full of diamonds or something that he tries to do. But so to me, I see the fundraising that goes on as the sort of thing where you're convincing them that I am, in fact, the coming caliph, and you should treat me that way by giving me your charity, giving me the zakat that usually goes to him. And as for the rest, well, those guys are out there doing this kind of dirty work, but I'll bet he doesn't turn down his 20%.
Yes.
Maury Amate, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. How significant and in what form is there Iranian support for al-Qaeda? Financial, training, safe havens. What is the Iranian role, if any?
Yeah. Look, Iran and al-Qaeda don't like each other. Both Iran and al-Qaeda will work with others that they don't like to further their goals. And so those who say that there is no connection whatsoever between Iran and al-Qaeda are wrong. And those who say that they are completely in the same boat together are also wrong. One of the things that we don't know, in particular because the Iranian side is so opaque, is how far these relationships go within the Iranian decision-making elite. So when a group of al-Qaeda operatives were arrested in Bahrain, I think it was 5 Bahrainis and a Qatari several years ago, they had traveled through Iran and they didn't have to get their passports stamped and they didn't have to have visas, and they went and made their way through the federally administrated tribal areas of Pakistan and then back through Iran. What does that mean? Does that mean that al-Qaeda bribed one border guard? Does it mean that it went higher than that? In this instance with al-Suri, the Treasury Department declassified intelligence indicating explicitly, and it was a big deal going through the interagency to put the language out this way, that this pipeline depended on, quote, an agreement between al-Qaeda and the Iranian government to allow this network to operate within its borders. and there are a couple other quotes along those lines. At some level, there is some type of cooperation. I don't think either completely trusts the other, but this also is nothing new. Iran was trading al-Qaeda operatives in the lead up to the East Africa embassy bombings, including, we believe, some of the individuals who participated in those bombings. And there's a whole host of history to that relationship. I'll leave it at there. If you're interested in that, the part of the Hezbollah book I have coming has a small section on that. You can read it there. Yes, right up front.
Thanks. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist. I have a question for Dr. Hoffman. We actually had an email conversation last week about Southeast Asia, so thanks for that. In your presentation, you talked about al-Qaeda's role in the Arab Spring, and you talked about it in relation to Syria, but not other parts. I was wondering if you had anything to add about other parts of the Arab Spring.
Well, I think the first response is the obvious one, that just like foreign ministries and state departments throughout the world were caught flat-footed and off balance by the Arab Spring, so was al-Qaeda. And of course, al-Qaeda was suffering under massive onslaughts as well. I think too soon to tell would be my view. In places, clearly in places in North Africa, even Egypt, al-Qaeda was not any kind of a factor, did not play any kind of a significant role. At the same time, in places like Yemen, al-Qaeda has incontrovertibly benefited, or at least al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and by extension, al-Qaeda Central has benefited beyond any doubt from the Arab Spring. I think one reason it's too soon to tell is when you look at a place like Egypt, where 26 key jihadis have been released from incarceration, including Zawahiri's brother-in-law, and upwards of 2,000 others that have been imprisoned. It's hard to say whether these people have, while they were detained, developed an understanding of democracy and of liberal principles, or rather they'll emerge from prison more hardened, more committed to warfare, and thus be grist for al-Qaeda's mill. I also very much worry is that, we in the West and in the United States in particular measure everything in a constrained time period that often is either a congressional term or a presidential term. I think all of our adversaries rather view time in a very different way and see these firstly as a generational struggle, not as a very temporal one. And for them, if they've invested the time and effort in this, and if they have the patience, and that's always what their fundamental conceit has been. I mean, even bin Laden, in recent years, his last famous videotape before the 2004 presidential election, he didn't say he was going to defeat us militarily on the battlefield. He said he was going to exhaust us and bankrupt us. And I think they still stick with that strategy. But the point I want to make is that from al-Qaeda's point of view, and I think this is one reason they play on the sectarianism among others, is they believe that there is a potential new pool of recruits that is emerging that they will be able to tap into. Either those who, because of the uncertainty and the instability that's going to sharpen sectarian frictions, will be grist for their recruitment mill, or else what they're hoping to do is tap into a reservoir of individuals that are going to see the political reforms that the Arab Spring has promised not materialize. We're going to see the hopes and prospects of economic development either be far slower than was anticipated or in fact be stagnant. And it's exactly these disenchanted, disillusioned, and impatient young individuals, many almost across the entirety of North Africa and the Middle East, there's already this huge youth bulge. No matter what happens in the near future, economic reform isn't going to deliver jobs to countries that have, a third or more of their population under 17 years of age. And it's exactly that pool that al-Qaeda seeks to tap into. And often in the discussion of al-Qaeda and the Arab Spring, I think people too much have conflated al-Qaeda to be a mass movement, or that they want to compete with the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think either is the case. Firstly, terrorism is never a mass movement. It's always a handful of people with the hubris that they can have disproportionate effects on events. And I don't think al-Qaeda is any different. They don't need thousands or even tens of thousands. What they need in these countries is a hard core of a few hundred people that they can draw into their organization, arm, and for reasons of catharsis, frustration, impatience, deploy. We often forget that the Red Army faction in Germany struggled on for 3 generations and over 30 years and never had more than basically 36 trigger pullers and bomb throwers. So it's true, a handful of people can have this disproportionate effect.
Mike over here for Eric, and while it's coming, one of the questions is whether these movements will end up connecting with the al-Qaeda core. In the meantime, Aaron in particular here at the Institute has been producing a tremendous number of articles on the growing jihadist movements within the countries affected by the Arab awakenings, not only in Syria, but in North Africa as well.
Eric Schmidt with the New York Times. If I could ask each of the panelists just to very briefly give a report card on how you feel Zawahiri has conducted himself as a leader of al-Qaeda Central over the past year or so since bin Laden's death. And should he be killed, is there anybody within the ranks of the core al-Qaeda leadership who could step up and have the kind of stature to command respect among their affiliates today? Thank you.
I would say I'd give him an A-. And the reason is because I think he has a very different vision, a very different view than bin Laden did. Bin Laden had this exhaustion, attrition strategy in mind when it came to the United States and the West, and he's continued that to a certain extent. But as I said, he has very much switched the focus to building affiliates and emirates in other countries and to increasing the strength of al-Qaeda in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. So, and he's been very successful at it. Here's the one thing about Zawahiri that I'm on a sort of knife's edge. As Rob mentioned, we had a little discussion beforehand in which I said if Zawahiri were really smart, he would never attack the United States again. Because that led to such disaster for them after 9/11, at least for the first few years. And it really set back a lot of the views or the vision that bin Laden had, and then you had to spend all of your time attriting the U.S. all over the world in order to convince us that it wasn't worth our while. So if he were smart, he would never attack us again, and we'd go back to sleep like we were in the 1990s, and you could go out and create whatever you wanted to, and we wouldn't pay any attention unless Americans got killed. But I don't know if he's that smart, and I also don't know if he's that patient, because I believe he's a man who's controlled by a desire for revenge for the death of his wife, the death of his son, and for the torture he underwent in Egyptian prisons. And he might not be able to control his anger, and that might lead him to do something intemperate.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I'd probably up it and give him an A. And this is because, again, the conventional wisdom about him 18 months ago or so was completely wrong. Everybody was saying he'd never live up to bin Laden's stature, could never fill bin Laden's shoes. He's held the movement together, I think far better than other people. The affiliates have grown and prospered under his leadership. He's proclaimed, I think, and evolved a very effective strategy, as I've described. And I could go on, but I want to answer your second question. I wouldn't right now want to identify an individual, but my guess would be, I'm almost certain it would have to be one of the progeny. We're going to see someone. It doesn't have to be an A-list name, but someone, just as Mary described, who's going to be motivated as much by this visceral desire for vengeance and is going to have the authority and stature because of their name and lineage. That will be the next leader of al-Qaeda. I don't think there's any shortage of those people.
I'm going to be contrarian, and I think it's actually very difficult to answer the question without being on the inside and seeing the current intelligence, which I no longer do. But my gut says that he at best gets a B, because I think that the vision that he laid out a long, long time ago. It's not at all clear to me that he is implementing it. The increase in the rise of the affiliates, I think that's because that's what he was inclined to do beforehand, and he's not strong enough to keep this unified under the al-Qaeda senior leadership anymore. In this area, the funding is really important. It is not the case, I don't think, that there's any 20% coming from these groups. He is coming with a cup and he's asking, and he's not always getting. And it puts him in a very, very weak position. He's sandpaper. I don't believe if I was the head of one of these affiliates flushing cash, and if I was al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and U.S. officials were constantly saying that the greatest threat to us today is not from al-Qaeda core, but from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, why would I feel the need to pay homage or otherwise to Ayman al-Zawahiri? I think the jury is out in the open source unclass. There's probably a better answer within the intelligence, but from an outsider looking in, I haven't seen any evidence that he's been able to actually marshal the power of the Arab awakening, something which he had nothing to do with. Young Arab students flashing cell phones, not guns, accomplished within weeks what he in particular in Egypt and al-Qaeda more generally failed to do through much bloodshed over many, many years, and I don't think he has yet to live that down. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to take, if it's okay, 3 questions. Oh, I'm sorry, Aaron, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I think it's sort of incomplete at this point, but I would say that he hasn't had the charisma to really motivate a lot of individuals. While he's put out many videos over the past year or two to countries in the Arab world and Syria, we see he had a whole series of videos to Egypt. Most of them are just broad rhetorical tapes, whereas you've seen with other individuals such as Abu Yahya al-Libi, who actually was allegedly killed in a drone strike, still hasn't been confirmed by al-Qaeda. He gave specific instructions to Libyans on what they should do. And I'm unsure that Zawahiri has the capacity at this point to provide actual insights into true governance that we've sort of seen at the local level that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been trying to attempt in the last year and a half, and that we're even seeing now in Mali with Ansar al-Din and al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb there. So I'm unsure that al-Qaeda Central and Zawahiri, while they might want to be involved in what's going on, they don't actually have the capacity to influence what's going on. And instead, we're seeing more these local groups rise up and really be the key influencers. And now that, you know, there's sort of a relative decline in al-Qaeda Central, and there's been more of a focus on the near enemy again, like we saw in the 1990s, these individuals might not want to be involved in sort of this broader global scheme that bin Laden first put forth in the late 1990s.
Sorry about that. Now, because we only have a few minutes left, I'll take the last 3 hands that I saw. Well, I'll take you together, Rafi, Alejandro, and Mike Kraft. If you could just give me brief questions, and we will give brief answers and go from there.
Rafi Danziger, advisor to AIPAC. And I'd like to broaden Maury Amitai's question about Iran to the bigger issue of state sponsorship and cooperation with al-Qaeda. Clearly, when the Taliban were in power in Afghanistan, was tremendously useful to al-Qaeda, and apparently elements in Pakistan are still helping the al-Qaeda. Can you talk about other government help or sponsorship to al-Qaeda today?
And now Mike Kraft just across the aisle, right here in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Kraft, counterterrorism writer and former State Department. This question is for Aaron, but it pings off of some comments that Bruce and others made. On the social media, have you noticed any changes in the trends of the kind of messages, especially since the Arab Spring, aimed at younger people, particularly since Egypt? And Matt talked a bit about the broad efforts to counter radicalism, extremism, but have you seen any indication of counter-blogging in the chat rooms, which some people have said has been going on, and do you think it has any impact?
And Alejandro right here.
Alejandro Butel, independent analyst. I'm doing some research right now on American Muslims that are countering extremist ideology in the marketplace of ideas. And this question is directed to you, Aaron. I find your research to be very fascinating in terms of what you've told me. And so I'm curious to know, have you come across in your research anything where American Muslims, for instance, have been involved in countering some key points of al-Qaeda's ideology? And one example I'll give really quickly was when a bunch of scholars back in 2010 had discovered that the notorious Mardin fatwa, which Dr. Hoffman had noted before, was in fact actually a fabrication based upon a misprint of the original text. And so I'm curious to know if you've come across anything else in your research, and if so, what have those discussions and debates been like?
Aaron, why don't you start?
Sure. So, new messages in social media. What we see in social media is that it's more or less the same type of ideological message that they put out in the past. But what's different, at least in terms of communications is that some of these groups and even ideologues, such as there's this famous Kuwaiti ideologue, they get to interact with these individuals online. They're grassroots supporters, which creates sort of tighter social networks in some respects. And even al-Shabaab, individuals online will ask them questions about what's going on in some battle in some particular city, or ask them about some Sharia-related issue. So it forges these even closer bonds that individuals might not have had otherwise, which is somewhat interesting. In terms of counter-blogging or individuals saying things on the forums, if there's something on the forums that is said that the moderators don't want other people to talk about, they'll delete the thread, and the topic will be off topic, essentially. One case was actually the Omar Hamami controversy. In English language forum, individuals wanted to know more about what was going on, and they were trying to ask, what does this mean for, you know, the movement, and how could there be this, you know, fight between Hamami, who's this great fighter for the group, and the leaders. And there were maybe 3 or 4 times that individuals put up threads, and within like an hour, all the threads were taken down. So there's a lot more control there in terms of the forums. In terms of social media, it's obviously a lot more chaotic, so people can throw ideas back at them. You see on Twitter many individuals actually taunting groups like the Taliban or al-Shabaab, or even Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the new premier jihadi group in Syria. Individuals, you know, that are trying to do it in a grassroots manner from the United States or Western Europe, they'll antagonize them and get in these arguments, which is somewhat amusing, since I'm not sure it really changes anything, but it does occur. And then in terms of al-Qaeda's responses to messages trying to counter them, I know that some of the revisions that some former jihadists did, like Dr. Fadl in the previous decade, Ayman al-Zawahiri actually sort of responded to it. But overall, especially with the Mardin fatwa, they really had a weak response. I mean, the main response was only from Adam Gadan and Anwar al-Awlaki, and it really didn't touch upon the actual specifics of what they were saying in Mardin at that conference. It was more these, you know, these individuals in the ulama, the religious scholars, are discredited because, you know, they're hypocrites and they're working with the apostates and all the typical rhetoric you'd hear about them, and that they're not part of the true ulama, and that what al-Qaeda needs is for the true ulama that believes in their ideology to step forward and, you know, put forward their own message. So they really haven't been in engagement with these ideas.
Okay, I think Aaron answered everything but the state sponsorship question. Rafi, it's a good question, which means we don't have enough time for it really here. I'll just end by saying that state sponsorship is still a major problem. In the Sunni extremist circles, I think the biggest open question, which is a huge policy issue that we don't have time to discuss right now, is Pakistan, much more than anything else. Otherwise, you're dealing with governments, not so much in terms of sponsorship, but tolerance. Are they doing enough to crack down? For example, as I mentioned earlier, how do we go about getting the Kuwaitis and the Qataris to do more on stemming the flow of funds, some of which is not even happening so covertly in their countries, to some very bad elements? That's not quite state sponsorship, but it's within that kind of family of problems. Please join me in thanking our panelists. This was wonderful. Thank you to C-SPAN. Thank you to all of you for coming. Have a wonderful day.